Okay. Parshas Matos, and in Parshas Matos, HaKadosh Baruch Hu repeats himself to Moshe about avenging Midyan for what they did to Klal Yisrael, how they tried to incite the Jewish people into sin and thereby make it easier to defeat Klal Yisrael in a war. And the Torah tells us that 1,000 from each Shevet, the drush is 2,000 from each Shevet. There's a whole discussion about it. But went to war, and Vayishlach osam Moshe elaf lamatel latzava osam bes Pinchas ben Elazar haKohen latzava uchli hakodesh v'chatros atru biyado. So Moshe sent the soldiers and Pinchas together with the army. Now Rashi asks the question: why did he send Pinchas? He should have sent Elazar. And actually, this question is asked by the Medrash. It's asked by the Gemara. So after all, Elazar, Pinchas' father, was the Kohen Gadol. So the question Rashi asks is why, and the Gemara and the Medrash is, why was Pinchas sent to accompany the soldiers, to be the spiritual guide of the soldiers in the war? Why didn't Elazar, his father, the son of Aaron HaKohen, the successor to Aaron, the Kohen Gadol, the head Kohen, why didn't he go? Why Pinchas? And the Gemara gives, and the Medrash adds one answer. There's a number of answers given. One answer is given because Pinchas began the mitzvah, because he's the one that killed Cosby. Cosby was the one that when they was involved in was involved with Zimri ben Solul, and the Cosby and Pinchas killed both Cosby and Zimri ben Solul, and it's who were engaged in inspiring the Jewish people, if I should use that word, if I could use that word, to lead the Jewish people on a path of sin and a path of immorality, in order to enable, at least in Cosby and Cosby's part, in order to enable the destruction of the Jewish people. So Hamaschel b'mitzvah lo gemor. So the one who begins the mitzvah, so we tell him to complete the mitzvah. And so that's one answer, and that's the answer given by the Medrash Tanchuma. But then the Gemara gives a different answer, and the answer that the answer the Gemara gives is because Pinchas was a descendant. That because Pinchas was a descendant of Yosef on his mother's side, and the Gemara goes into a whole discussion. How was he a descendant of Yosef on his mother's side? But he was a descendant of Yosef, and the Midyanim played a role in the selling of Yosef down to Egypt. So consequently, he was picked to be the spiritual leader in the battle against Midyan. And then the Gemara gives a third answer, and the third answer is Shahaya Mishluach Milchama. because Pinchas, and not just here, on Rosh Chodesh Nisan, when the Mishkan was dedicated, at the very beginning, Pinchas was appointed as the Meshuach Muhammad, the Kohen who was anointed to be the spiritual leader of the Jewish people going out to war. So, because of that, it was Pinchas's job to accompany the soldiers. It was by virtue of his position as the Meshuach Muhammad that he had to accompany them to the battlefield. So, because of that, the Pinchas was chosen, not the Elazar. Now, now it's very odd. In last week's Sedra, when HaKadosh Baruch Hu praises Pinchas, he gives him as Brishi Shalom, my covenant of peace. And it's odd that he, the Meshuach Muhammad, is given the covenant of peace. But more odd, since he was appointed Meshuach Muhammad, before the bracha was given, before the whole incident of Cosby, why is it that Pinchas, the Ish HaShalom, the man who is identified as having the covenant of peace, identified with peace, is at the same time chosen to, in a sense, even lead and play a major role in the Jewish people going to war shortly afterwards. It's odd. It seems inconsistent. On one hand, just having been identified now as the symbol of the covenant of peace, and at the other hand, he goes to war. He joins, in a sense, the army in their battle against, and while the battle was certainly necessary, the battle against Midyan was certainly necessary, but you would think that somebody else would go, not the person who is identified with the covenant of peace. Now, there is a machlokes, a dispute between the Rambam and the Ravid. There are two types of war. There's a Melchemes Mitzvah. The Gemara suggests other names according to Rabbi Yehuda, but I'm discussing it according to the way we paskin. There are two types of war. There's a Melchemes Mitzvah, a war of peace, and there are three forms, according to the Rambam, of war of peace. There is a war of peace, a war. Three Melchemes Mitzvah, three wars that are Melchemes Mitzvah, that are obligatory wars, that are required wars. One is Melchemes Hamalek, the war against Hamalek. The other is the war against the 7 nations, the Shiva Amimim, who resided in Eretz Canaan prior to the Jewish people coming there. And the third war, according to the Rambam, is Yisrael, Melchemes Yisrael Miyad Sor Shaba Aleim, the war of the Jewish people against the enemy that attacked them. And the question is asked, we know, Melchemes Amalek, the Torah says, Machot Timches Echer Amalek, eradicate the memory of Amalek. We know where the mitzvah is mentioned in the Torah. Melchemes Shiva Amim, the war against the 7 nations who resided in Eretz Canaan. We know, Hachrem Tachrimein. But the war against the nation that attacks us, Where is that mitzvah mentioned? If it's halachically called a milchemes mitzvah. Now it's very logical. It's the most logical form of war. If we're attacked, we have to defend ourselves. But if it's called a milchemes mitzvah, there has to be a mitzvah in the Torah directing us to fight that war. Where is that mitzvah mentioned? And my father would always mention the Medrash Tanchuma. The Medrash Tanchuma is on Parshas Pinchas, last week's Sedra. Tzoras Midyanim, ki tzorim heim lachem. So the harass, the kisemosam, ki tzorim heim lachem, because they are harassing you. And the Medrash Tanchuma says, Habar laharcha hashkem lahargo. If somebody comes to attack you, you get up to attack him. You defend yourself. And while we have the Parsha of Machteres, that if somebody digs into the house and there's reason to believe that he's coming to kill me or that he might kill me, so I am allowed to kill him first. That's on an individual level. But on a national level, how do I know if a nation attacks me? That I'm allowed to attack them. And when a nation attacks me, sometimes it becomes necessary to bomb people who are not the individual soldiers who attacked me. But the whole nation has the status of invaders who have come to destroy me as a nation, to destroy the Jewish people. And consequently, the Jewish people not only have a right, but an obligation and a mitzvah in resisting the attack of the nations of the world. Where is that mitzvah? The Medrash Tanchuma, Tzoras Midyanim, harass the Midianites, be kisimosam, and fight with them, kitzorim heim lachem, because they are harassing you with their conspiracies. So milchemes Midyan is the source. It's not only that milchemes Midyan is a milchemes mitzvah, a war of mitzvah, but it's a source for all the wars of defense that the Jewish people will encounter. If a nation attacks them, they are allowed and obligated to resist the attack. Habar laharcha hashkem lahargo, even on a national level. Now it's very interesting that there is a dispute between the Rambam and the Ravid. The halacha that we have to appoint a Meshuach Muhammad, a Kohen who goes out with the people, who talks to the people, whether that applies to all wars or that apply or it applies only to Milchemes Rishus, only to a voluntary war, but it doesn't apply. Now, what's a voluntary war? Voluntary war is where it's not a war of defense, but there's reason for the Jewish people to go and attack another nation. And what the reasons are discussed in the Gemara. But it's not a war of immediate defense. Maybe the nation represents a potential threat. And other reasons. So Milchemes Rishus, a voluntary war. They used to appoint a Meshuach Muhammad. But whether for a Milchemes Mitzvah, a war of mitzvah, they appointed Mashuach Muhammad, that there is dispute between the Rambam and the Rabbi. The Rambam's opinion is that even for a Milchemes Mitzvah, even for a war of mitzvah, so you had a Mashuach Muhammad, you appointed a Mashuach Muhammad. The Ravid said no, for a Milchemes Mitzvah, you didn't appoint the Mashuach Muhammad. Some say that you did have a Mashuach Muhammad according to the Ravid, but I want to focus on the opinion of the Rambam. And it's very likely that the Rambam goes with the opinion. So according to the opinion of the Rambam, the Mashuach Muhammad was appointed even for a war of mitzvah, even for the required war. So the question is, what's the Gemara's question? The Gemara asks, why did Pinchas go? Why didn't Elazar, Pinchas' father, who was the Kohen Gadol, why didn't he go? Why was Pinchas the one who was sent to the war? Then the Gemara gives three answers. And the final answer is, he was the Mashuach Muhammad. But according to the Rambam, we have to understand the other answers. What was the question in the first place? There's a requirement to send the Mashuach Muhammad even to all wars, even to a Milchemes Mitzvah. And Pinchas was appointed many years beforehand. On Rosh Chodesh Nisan, the day of the dedication of the Mishkan, he was appointed as the Mashuach Muhammad, as the anointed Kohen for the war. So what's the question? Why did Pinchas go? He had to go, according to the Rambam's opinion. So, and it's obvious that Milchemes Midyan was a Milchemes Mitzvah. So, obviously, according to the Rambam, we had to appoint a Mashuach Muhammad. Now, it's mentioned in some of the books that were written in time of the Chashmonaim that when Yehuda HaMaccabi, when he went to war, a war of defense against the Greeks, so he read the Parshas in the Torah of that the Mashuach Muhammad would read to the soldiers. And the Parshas contained, I would say, three elements in it. One element was those who were not required to go to war. Another element was encouraging the people, encouraging the soldiers, telling them that God will be with them in their battle. And the third element, and I'm not putting it in the specific order, and the third element was that they had to be aware of the consequences of not devoting themselves mentally, fully to the battle. So the question is asked by the Minchas Chinuch, that it seems from these sources, it's true, these sources were not halachic sources. It's Svarim Chitzonim. But nevertheless, the Minchas Chinuch asks the question. He seems to have felt that the information given over was accurate. And he asks, Mashuach Muhammad became a Mashuach Muhammad, a Kohen, who accompanied the Jewish people to war, was anointed with the special anointing oil. This oil was created by Moshe Rabbeinu, and it was hidden. at the end of the first Commonwealth, shortly before the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed. Matter of fact, in the second Beis Hamikdash, the Kohen Gadol did not have. There were two types of Kohen Gadol. There was a Kohen Gadol who became a Kohen Gadol because he was anointed with the anointing oil. And in the second Beis Hamikdash, when they didn't have the anointing oil, you had the special clothes of the Kohen Gadol. And as a result, there was a whole process. But as a result of putting on these clothes in a certain process over a certain amount of days, the Kohen Gadol assumed the role of Kohen Gadol even without the anointing oil. But when it came to the Mashuach Muhammad, at least according to some opinions in the Gemara, Mashuach Muhammad could only be appointed with the anointing oil. So that means that during the Second Commonwealth, during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, they couldn't have had a Kohen Mashuach Muhammad because there was no anointing oil to appoint him as the Kohen who accompanied the Jewish people in battle. So the question is, how could Yehuda, who is the leader of the Jewish people in battle, read the Parsha of the Kohen Mashuach Muhammad when in the Second Commonwealth there was no anointing oil? So there couldn't be a Kohen that was a Mashuach Muhammad, an anointed Kohen. And because of that, and some other questions, Rav Yitzchak Ponevezher felt that there was no real halachic Mashuach Muhammad during the second Beis Hamikdash, during the second temple. But they created sort of like an honorary position, an honorary title of Mashuach Muhammad. Apparently, there was a person appointed. He didn't have special halachic status, but he was appointed to be the spiritual leader of the soldiers. However, my grandfather, Zatzal, gave a different explanation. And he based it on a question that he had discussed, that he had raised with my great-grandfather, Rabbi. The Gemara tells us that the Mashuach Muhammad, that the reading of the Parsha of Mashuach Muhammad, the mitzvah of reading the Parsha that contained the three elements of encouragement to the soldiers, of who had dispensation to leave from the war, and warning them about the consequences of the enemy attack unless we fight back completely. So the Gemara says, I would think it should be read by the Kohen Gadol. This is the Yerushalmi said, but no, there's a special Zeres HaKasav that it's read by the Kohen, by the Mashuach Muhammad. In other words, there was reason to believe that while there might be a Mashuach Muhammad, but the Parsha was read by the Kohen Gadol. So the Gemara says, no, it's read by the Mashuach Muhammad. So the simple understanding of the Gemara is that the Kohen Gadol couldn't read the Parsha. But my grandfather suggested, and Reb Chaim, my grandfather writes, thought that would probably be correct. That the Kohen Gadol was on a higher level obviously, than the Mashuach Muhammad. But in terms of Dusha, the Kohen Mashuach Muhammad was on the secondary level. The question is, since the Kohen Gadol was on a higher level, perhaps the Gemara only tells me it doesn't have to be the Kohen Gadol who reads the Parsha. But just as the Mashuach Muhammad could read the Parsha, could read those chapters in the Torah in Parshas Shoftim, which the Mashuach Muhammad, the Kohen who went out to war, read to the soldiers, giving them encouragement. The mitzvah could also be fulfilled by the Mashuach Muhammad, but the Kohen Gadol could certainly fulfill that mitzvah. And we could suggest that perhaps that was the question. So my grandfather said perhaps that Yehuda, at that point in the war, he became a Kohen Gadol. It's true, they didn't have anointing oil, but a Kohen Gadol could become a Kohen Gadol by putting on the 8 clothes of the Kohen Gadol, even when there was no anointing oil available. And being a Kohen Gadol who was on a higher level than the Kohen Mashuach Muhammad, who had a higher level of Dusha, a higher level of holiness. So perhaps he could also fulfill the function of the Mashuach Muhammad. We have a statement in the Gemara, Mana b'chlal Masayim Mana. When you have 200, you have 100 also. Included in 200 is 100. And perhaps included in being the Kohen Gadol is included being the Mashuach Muhammad as well. So that was the Gemara's question. The Gemara's question was, why did Pinchas go out to war? Why didn't his father Elazar go to war? After all, Elazar was the Kohen Gadol. And being the Kohen Gadol, he was capable of fulfilling the functions of the Kohen Mashuach Muhammad as well. So we could say that all the answers to that question agree, according to the Rambam, that a Milchemes mitzvah, you need a Mashuach Muhammad to go out. But a Kohen Gadol could serve as a Mashuach Muhammad. And the question was, why was Pinchas chosen over Elazar? And a number of answers are given. One is, instead of using the Kohen Gadol, they used the Mashuach Muhammad because he began the mitzvah. Hamaschel b'mitzvah omrim lo gemor. And also because Pinchas, through his mother, was a descendant from Yosef. And the Midyanites played a role in bringing Yosef down as a prisoner to Egypt, as a slave and as a prisoner. And then the final answer says, because he was the Mashuach Muhammad, the final answer held that no, only the Mashuach Muhammad could fulfill that position. The Kohen Gadol could not fulfill that position. Now, what was the job of the Mashuach Muhammad? What statements were made? There were statements of encouragement, statements warning them that unless they fought their best, The enemy would not have mercy on them. Statements that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help them. Those were the statements of encouragement. And also statements relieving them of their certain soldiers were told that they should not go out to war. Those who built the house and did not yet dedicate the house, those who planted a vineyard, should not go out to war. Those who just got married should not go out to war. That was also part of the statement of the Mashiach Muhammad. And there is a machlokes between Rashi and Ibn Ezra. Why is it? And Rashi understands it, that because if these people would be killed in war, so if these people would be killed in war, it would be heartbreaking. It would have a bad impact. And the Ibn Ezra says the reason these people were exempt from war was because war requires soul concentration, concentrating on the war, concentrating on the fighting. And these people would be thinking about their new vineyard, about their new marriage, about their new house. And it would distract them from fulfilling their position as soldiers. And I want to suggest, perhaps along the lines of Rashi, that the idea is I think, there was an additional purpose, and this could work well with Rashi's pshat. There was an additional purpose in the letting these soldiers go. Because we know that, I've discussed it many times, that when the Torah counts the Levium, the Torah counts the Levium from 30 days old and up. But when it counts the members of the other Shvatim, it counts them from the age of 20 and up. What's the idea? But the answer is, the Levium were the symbols of spirituality. Spirituality has to be part of the personality of the person. What was the significance of the age of 20? The age of 20 is when they enter the army. It is necessary to have an army. Those who think otherwise are foolish. And those that do not have gratitude for those who are fighting on behalf of the Jewish people, who are giving their lives on behalf of the Jewish people. And as the Medrash tells us, the Gemara tells us that the Jews who went out for Midyan, they were giving their lives over. And every Jewish soldier that goes out to fight the battle to save the lives of the Jewish people is not just fighting for himself, he's fighting for all the Jewish people. And if I can add, to a certain degree, not just to the Jewish people of Eretz Yisrael, but to the Jewish people of the whole world. We don't know where the Jewish people of the other countries would be if there hadn't been a state of Israel. So the but being a soldier is not a lifelong goal. Things that a person learns from infanthood, that becomes part of his personality. Being a soldier was not meant, the Jewish people were not meant to have the personality of soldiers. They were meant to have the skills of a soldier, because fighting is only necessary when it's absolutely necessary. And the halacha determines when it's absolutely necessary. We're now Mamlechas Kohanim v'Goy Kadosh. And at times it's necessary to go out to fight. And at times, if it's necessary, Hakol Yotzin, everybody goes out to fight. As the Mishnah in Sota tells us. But that's not our goal in life. Being a soldier is a skill, and we have to develop those skills for the Jewish soldiers. And we have to recognize and have gratitude to them for sacrificing their lives on our behalf. But our goal is not to make being a soldier part of their personality, only to give them those skills because it's absolutely necessary. Things that we learn when we reach the age of 20 are not likely to become part of our personality. They are skills. Things that we learn from infanthood onward. That comes part of our personality. Spirituality has to be part of the personality of the Jew. And you imbue spirituality from infanthood onward. In fact, the Gemara mentions of cases that mothers of Tanoim would bring their children to the Beis Medrash just to hear the words of Torah. So I think that's the idea. The idea is, you should know, fighting wars is not our goal. Yes, it's important. The future of the Jewish people is dependent upon the war. But the goal is Mi'esh Hashem on the Bayis, is raising a family. And it has to be, as we learn, there has to be a marriage, a family that is halachically recognized as a permissible family. It has to be a family, it has to be a house that is a house of mitzvah. Because our goal is not even having houses here in Chutz La'aretz, outside the land of Eretz Yisrael. The ultimate goal is having a house in Eretz Yisrael. And the ultimate goal is that when we plant vineyards or gardens or whatever it might be, we're planting them in Eretz Yisrael. So in order to emphasize, there were exceptions in certain Milchemes Mitzvah, I don't want to go into it now. But as a general rule, the general rule is we wanted to emphasize to the soldiers, yes, we're fighting a war, but that's not the goal. The goal is returning to regular life in Eretz Yisrael. And It's interesting, the Yerushalmi asks the question, how do we know that someone who is a Meshuach Muhammad, someone who is an anointed, anointed to be the Kohen that goes out to war, together with the Jewish soldiers, how do we know that he could eventually become a Kohen Gadol? And Yerushalmi says, we learn it out from Pinchas. Pinchas, after his father Elazar died, he assumed the role. And he had been previously a Meshuach Muhammad. What's the idea? So the answer is a Meshuach Muhammad. What was the Gemara's kasha? What was the Yerushalmi's question? Why shouldn't a Meshuach Muhammad be able to become a Kohen Gadol? But the question is, how do we see the position of a Meshuach Muhammad? What is the main function of the Meshuach Muhammad? To give strength, to say that God is with them, to warn them about the enemy. But also, I think that they should be aware that the ultimate goal is not war. And it's very interesting that the Yerushalmi, the Gemara, the Bavli, Yerushalmi also discusses that we're between Shavuos Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. And the Gemara asks the question in Rosh Hashanah, Daf Yud Ches, we have a pasuk, Tzom Revi, B'Tzom HaChamishi, B'Tzom HaShvi, B'Tzom HaAsiri. The fast of the 4th month, which is Shavuos Tammuz, because Tammuz is the 4th month, counting from Nisan. B'Tzom HaChamishi, that's Tisha B'Av, because Av is the 5th month, counting from Nisan. B'Tzom HaShvi, that's Tzom Gedalia. B'Tzom HaAsiri, that's Asar B'Teves. All these days are associated with the Churban, with the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, with the Jewish people going to Golas, going to exile. So, Yiyu Lebeis Yehuda L'Sasam L'Simcha, will come days of joy. And the Gemara says, on one hand, you say the days of fasting. On the other hand, you say they will become days of joy. And the Gemara says, without going into all details, Bizman She'ei Shalom, when there will be peace, it will be Sasam V'Simcha, these will be holidays. And the Rabbeinu Hananel says, what does it mean, Bizman She'ei Shalom? Kol Zman She'Beis HaMikdash Kayim. As long as the Beis HaMikdash is in existence, as long as the Beis HaMikdash is in existence, so it'll be days of peace. It will be holidays. That's the way Rabbeinu Hananel. Rambam explains it differently, but that's how Rabbeinu Hananel learns it. Many say Rashi held like Rabbeinu Hananel. So, in other words, the Beis HaMikdash is identified with days of peace. Why is the Beis HaMikdash identified with days of peace? But I think the reason the Beis HaMikdash is identified with days of peace is because we're told in Shmuel, when David wanted to make the Beis HaMikdash, and he approached the Navi for permission to make the Beis HaMikdash, it said, "Hashem heniach lo mikol oyevav misaviv." God gave him relief from all his enemies around him. In other words, it was a time of peace. It wasn't a time that lent itself to war. It seems being a time of peace is a prerequisite for the building of the Beis Hamikdash. So it says, Bisman Shiyeh Shalom. Now, there wasn't peace throughout the whole duration of the Beis Hamikdash. But since the building of the Beis Hamikdash is dependent upon the prerequisite of there being peace, so the whole period of the Beis Hamikdash is called Bisman Shiyeh Shalom. Kolomar, Rabbeinu Chana says, in other words, Kol Zman Shebeis Hamikdash Kayam. Why is that? Why is it that peace is a prerequisite for building the Beis Hamikdash? But the reason that peace is a prerequisite for building the Beis Hamikdash is because, and that's why David HaMelech could not build the Beis Hamikdash, even though he wanted to, even though it was Behiniach Hashem Mikolayevav B'Saviv, Harbe Damim Shefachta. You David up till now, and well, Pidin, you're allowed to, you're even required to. But the Beis Hamikdash cannot be identified as an edifice of war, as a monument to victory of war. The Beis Hamikdash has to be identified as a house of peace. And the Beis Hamikdash, that's permanent. And our goal is peace. And even in building parts of the Beis Hamikdash, the Mizbeach, and all that, you couldn't use metal at all to cut the stones. Why? Because the stones are symbolic of the sword, which ends the life of man. So the Beis Hamikdash is the symbol of peace. So the question is, maybe the Mashiach Muhammad, the one who is designated primarily for the task of going to war, should not become a Kohen Gadol, because the Kohen Gadol is identified with peace. The Kohen Gadol is in charge of the Beis Hamikdash. So the Gemara says, the Yerushalmi says, no, Pinchas became a Kohen Gadol, and he was previously a Mashiach Muhammad. So what is it? Is it that our whole perspective changes as to who can be a Kohen Gadol? Or no, a Mashiach Muhammad is not to be seen as a man of war, but the Mashiach Muhammad should be seen as a man of peace. Because the ultimate goal is peace. We are not a nation of warriors. Being a soldier, while it's a skill that we have to develop and we're required to develop, but that cannot be the personality of the Jew. The personality of the Jew has to be a spiritual personality. It has to be a personality of peace, a personality of raising a family, a personality of building houses, of planting vineyards. That's part of our personality, and that's the perpetuation of Judaism. War gives us the ability to survive, but survival gives us the ability to build the Jewish people and to build the Jewish nation, and that cannot be done by the sword. And I think perhaps we could suggest that this was the idea how Pinchas, on one hand, on the contrary, Pinchas, so we could suggest that that was the Gemara's question. Because once the Mashiach Muhammad is identified with peace, so the Kohen Gadol could also do it. But perhaps because Pinchas had just been given the Brisi Shalom, he was given the covenant of peace. So immediately afterwards, for him to go out to war would not have been appropriate. So perhaps Eliezer should have gone. And Eliezer could have fulfilled the function of the Mashuach Muhammad. As my grandfather explained in the Gemara, and answered the Minchas Chinuch's question, and especially in view of the fact that the Mashuach Muhammad, though he went out to war, his main function was to emphasize that the goal of the war was peace, not war. So the Gemara says, no, there was special reason why Pinchas had to go out and Eliezer couldn't go out. And those reasons were because Hamaskal b'mitzvah omrim lo gemor. It was to show that what Pinchas did was a mitzvah. And the second thing is, and that's a general rule, he had to complete that mitzvah. And then the second thing is that because to identify the Midyanim, in other words, the Baal Turim points out that if they didn't go to war, and this is the simple explanation, Soras HaMidyanim Kitzarim Hein Lachem, harass the Midianites because they harass you. Mikan Habar Laharcha, someone comes to kill you, you kill them. So it seems to say we have to do it as a defense. But the Midianites were no longer involved in the fight. It doesn't seem there was an impending war. The answer is that there was reason to believe. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was telling the Jewish people, Habar lahar hashkem lahar go. In other words, they are ready to attack you. They're just waiting for the right moment. It's not just a potential enemy. They will attack you. So it was a war of defense, but the purpose of the war was for us to be able to live in peace, that no nation shall attack us to disturb our peace, and for us to be able to build our families, to build our homes, and to build our vineyards, our agriculture in Eretz Yisrael. It's interesting that the Chassam Sofer suggests that planting in Eretz Yisrael, and we see it anyway from the Yerushalmi, there's riots from the Yerushalmi, that building a house in Eretz Yisrael, planting vineyards in Eretz Yisrael, all that is part of the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, of living in Eretz Yisrael. And that's the goal. The goal is to be able to live in Eretz Yisrael with peace. There was no contradiction between the Bris Shalom of Pinchas and Pinchas going out to war. Okay.
Thank you. If anyone has questions, please put them in the chat. One question, just a clarification. It's a Machlokas Rishonim. If you could just explain it. Some people felt that Pinchas wasn't a Kohen until now, so how could he have been the Mashuach Muhammad? But the
so the Das Kain with Baal Tosfos says that initially, up to that point, he couldn't be a soldier. He couldn't have been a Kohen working in the Beis Hamikdash. But in Mashuach Muhammad, he was. The Medrash mentioned that's one of the 10 things, the celebrations on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. That
so he was Mashuach Muhammad for 40 years already, or for 38
That's right.
years.
That's correct.
Okay, another question. One of the things
the Das Kain with Baal Tosfos on the Torah discusses that.
Yeah. One of the things the Mashuach Muhammad said was, if you're afraid, you should leave. And that was a reason for exempting soldiers. So how does that fit in with your explanation? unless they couldn't focus on war because of their fear.
Yeah, because that's the nature of fear. If one starts running, lots start running. That's why there was the fear that they would cause a panic among the soldiers.
If we're not a nation of warriors, why is Milchemes Rishus allowed?
Because there was, depending on the situation, there were special needs when you consulted it, but you had to consult with the Sanhedrin, with the V'Tumim, and in other words, you needed the approval of God. You could not fight the Milchemes Rishus without V'Tumim, without Sanhedrin, and without a Melech. So those were prerequisites for Milchemes Rishus.
Can you give a quick answer how the Ravid deals with the fact that this was a Milchemes mitzvah and there was a...
Yes, I could give it, because in other words, the Ravid's opinion was that when is it, well, two things we could say in the Ravid. We could say that the Ravid held that the machlokes between him and the Rambam is the machlokes and the different answers, although it's not mistaber that. But so we could say that they're just cholik on which lashon we passen like. The Rambam paskins like the last lashon that it was because he was a Meshuach Muhammad. But it could be, the Ravid will say, the other Lashonas held, no, he wasn't the Meshuach Muhammad. He just went out to war with them. That's one thing that we could say. It was a special reason because Hamaschal b'mitzvah Omrim lo Gemor, or because it was a special harasha at that time because of what happened to Yosef. So that's one thing that we could say to answer the Ravid. The second thing we could say to answer the Ravid is that, in other words, when is the halacha that we don't appoint a Meshuach Muhammad by a Milchemes mitzvah? That halacha applies only when everybody has to go out to war. But if not everybody is required to go to war, only when it's a halacha of hakol yotzin, everybody has to go out to war. But here, there wasn't a requirement of everybody going out to war. It was 2,000 from each Shevet. So then we could say that there were people who had special dispensations, and they could supply the people who had special dispensations, because we could be careful which 1,000 we sent or which 2,000 we sent out to war. That's another explanation that we could say in the Ravid. And then there's a third explanation, although that's controversial. There are some say that even the Ravid held that by a Milchemes mitzvah, we have a Meshuach Muhammad. But the Ravid's opinion was the Meshuach Muhammad only read the parsha of encouragement to the people, not the parsha of the dispensations. But my uncle felt that the Ravid Shita wasn't that way. And that when the Ravid suggests that, he's only suggesting that as an explanation in the Rambam. So those are the three pshatim that you could say in the Ravid.
Does Rav Zevin discuss it in Lior Halacha?
I can't tell you for sure, but I'm sure that he discusses it. But I doubt that he gives all these answers. I'm sure he discusses the machlokas, the Rambam and the Ravid about that. I know for sure he mentions the Yerushalmi, because that's where I first saw it. He mentions the Yerushalmi about how do we know that the Kohen Gadol would could be someone who formerly was a Meshuach Muhammad.
And Daniel wants to cause a little trouble here. Is there any validity to suggest Yeshiva Brachim are patur from war because they're distracted?
We'll discuss it another time.
Okay.